very much for inviting me to the forum. I'm very excited. I'm excited because at one point I thought I should change the name of my APEC Study Center to just Asia Pacific and drop the APEC part. But now there's so much enthusiasm about APEC and FTAP and all of these things which I've been talking about for many years, so I'm very pleased to hear that. So my center will continue at Berkeley. I heard the ambassador, listening to the ambassador was really an amazing experience. I thought I had been sent back in time 6 years to the American ambassador saying exactly the same thing. So if you're worried about convergence, there's complete convergence. Unfortunately, I don't like FTAP, which I told the American ambassador at that time, and I'm not sure I like FTAP now. Not because I think FTAP is a bad idea in principle, but I think because FTAP is not feasible politically right now. So my criticism 6 years ago, which I wrote, and there's a book about it as well, has nothing to do with the economic aspects. It has more to do with the political feasibility. So what I thought I would do is talk about some background and evolution of trade agreements in the Asia Pacific. And my presentation today will be primarily conceptual in nature rather than empirical. And the reason for that is because negotiations are always ongoing, and I'm not a reporter, so I don't know the latest, hottest, great thing that has happened in any particular agreement, so that's not really my objective. As an academic, I'm much more interested in trying to think about these issues from a conceptual standpoint and from a political economy standpoint. So I think, as the ambassador rightly pointed out, we've seen a dramatic transformation in Asia from one where you had almost no trade agreements, that the GATT was dominant, and of course then the WTO was quite dominant, and of course I'm still a fan of the multilateral system. And Bogor girls, Simon Evnett, my colleague, and I are the only defending members left of the WTO. Unfortunately, everybody has become so enamored of first FTAs, then regional FTAs, then trans-regional FTAs. And Asia has moved from an under-institutionalized situation to a completely over-institutionalized situation. Fortunately, that's good for my academic work because I've always worried about the question of institutional fit. And so I worry about how do you have nesting, how do arrangements fit one within another, how might they be complementary, how might you have kind of conflict or competition among them. And so those are the issues I've explored. So I think those issues are unfortunately becoming ripe in Asia, in the Asia Pacific, when we see all these different kinds of arrangements. So the kinds of characteristics that I think it's useful to consider is to view this from a country perspective and from an institutional or systemic perspective. And from a country perspective, countries have to choose the number of accords they'd like to sign and the kind of regional sequencing. And I think the number is pretty clear. The regional sequencing is a more interesting idea. The question is, do you first seek agreements trans-regionally, or do you seek them within the region? And many people refer to these agreements as regional agreements. I strongly object to this WTO language, which is completely misleading. To call an agreement between Chile and Japan, or between Mexico and Japan, or the United States and Singapore a regional agreement makes no sense. There's no region there. I think it should be called a trans-regional or cross-regional agreement. And I think the fact of whether you're making agreements in a regional basis or a trans-regional basis actually has important economic and political implications, which is why conceptually it's interesting. In terms of institutional characteristics, we can look at the scope of the agreement. That is, what are the kinds of issues, what kind of scope, the breadth of the agreement. We can look at the geography of the agreement. That is, are we having regional agreements or trans-regional agreements? So actor scope is the first thing. Then we can have partner size. And I think that's an important concern, which is rightly pointed out by the ambassador, as to whether you have developed or developing countries and trying to make the agreement suitable for all members. And I think in the WTO, we have a mechanism already of special and differential treatment for developing countries to make them more willing to work within the WTO and feel confident that they can also compete. Issue scope is a very big issue, because the question is, what issues should be considered? And again, we heard about, should you have intellectual property in the agreement? Should we have services in the agreement? Of course, different countries being at different positions in the division of labor, it's hardly surprising that they have different views. China, for example, has an aggressive, active industrial policy, and it's very difficult for China actually to join TPP to meet the requirements of TPP. So when we think about issue scope, I think one of the problems is that, you know, when the Americans were saying China may want to join TPP, I said, ask them to join. See if they can meet the requirements that are very high-level standards. So I think the notion that somehow this is a balancing game or this is part of the, I mean, American politicians say lots of things, but I think from an economic standpoint, this is really about trying to separate industrial policy from trade policy. And Simon and I have been working on this, and we can see China is not the worst offender by any means. In fact, in our new study, the EU is the worst offender in terms of instruments that violate the WTO or try to circumvent the WTO. You can also talk about the nature of agreements. Are they very liberal? Are they protectionist? Are they somewhere in between? And finally, we can talk about institutional strength. And many countries don't like to have very strong agreements which are supranational, like the WTO, whereas other countries like to have those, like, especially legalistic societies like the United States, think that it's great to have this kind of dispute settlement mechanism. So I won't bore you with this anymore. I want to just show you some examples of looking how we can use this kind of spider chart to look at different kinds of arrangement. We can see what ASEAN looks like on these dimensions in terms of geography, actor scope, issue scope, and the like. Broad, I won't, you know, go into the details. We can look at RCEP, which is actually not very much liberalizing and has a low degree of institutionalization. I think that's the most interesting thing. It's broad in scope, but of course it does not cover a number of things that are behind the border, right? So we talk about liberalization, but liberalization is not about border arrangements at tariffs and quotas. It's about behind the border industrial policy. And one of my former students, who is now an eminent professor, Sung-Young Oh, has worked on industrial policy and provincial policy in China, and of course using industrial policy at that level as well. So those issues of what's covered or not are quite important. If we look at APEC, which I'm very fond of, obviously, APEC has tried to expand its mandate, and many people worry that APEC has expanded its scope so much, and yet its level of institutionalization has not increased very much. So the problem I see about FTAP is not that economically it doesn't make sense in terms of, obviously, you don't need a CGE model to convince me that broader trade agreements are better than narrower trade agreements. In general, that's a standard economic idea. The real issue is that if you do not have an institutionalized process for negotiations, these negotiations will be interminable and will drag on forever. And so therefore, if you want to make sure that we never get an agreement, pushing FTAP with a 15-year time frame is a very slow process. And I think the interest that the Chinese have now in APEC 2014, APEC FTAP, is a lot to do with the fact that TPP is moving very quickly. So I think it's rather ironic that the Americans kept talking about FTAP, 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 and now the Chinese suddenly are enamored of FTAP. Now, if we look at TPP, TPP, of course, is much more institutionalized, much broader in scope, and has a number of different actors. TPP itself has many flaws, as might be pointed out by lots of people. And because of strong protectionist interests in the United States, there are sectors that are being excluded from TPP. And as someone who believes in open liberal trade, I think that's a problem. I think the Japanese would also like to exclude a number of sectors. So TPP negotiations themselves are fraught with difficulty, but simply folding that in institutionally at this point into FTAP, I don't think is a starter. And I won't talk about this given the time limits, but basically this kind of framework to look at how institutions are designed and evolve over time is something I've worked on for a long time. And we need to think about what are the changes that have led to calls for modifying the existing institution and creating new ones, and also how do you do institutional reconciliation. So I think that was a very good point that the ambassador made, which is let's start thinking more about how RCEP and TPP can fit together. Are they going to be complementary, competing? Are they going to be nested? FTAP as an ultimate goal makes a lot of sense, and FTAP itself should be consistent with the WTO. So there are a number of things I fully agree with, but I think the timing is the issue here. So if we look at this movement from ASEAN to RCEP, we've seen very little institutionalization in ASEAN plus 3, and we were having these very strong contending visions, and China, of course, preferred ASEAN plus 3 to maintain its influence. But I think the progress in the TPP led the Chinese government to change its mind. I don't know what goes on in the Chinese government, so I can't predict that. But I think the Chinese became concerned about the rapid movement and therefore agreed to go on with this ASEAN plus 6. And we know there's this target of 2015. And of course, the way these kinds of agreements, if you look at the China-ASEAN agreement or these agreements, it's easier for China to just sign an agreement and work out the details later. The Americans, as we saw yesterday, was pointed out by Professor Schiller, have so many lawyers that the Americans want everything in writing before they can sign any agreement. So the Chinese are much more flexible here when it comes to concluding agreements. So I think RCEP may be signed before TPP at the way things are going. So we know about TPP, and people often say this is an American idea to have all these goals. The irony, of course, is these goals were not set by the Americans. These goals were set by the Singaporeans. It was the Singaporeans and New Zealand who came up with this list. In fact, this list is basically copied from the original P4 agreement. So the notion that the Americans suddenly are worried about intellectual property and entry of people and so on, this is not an American idea. The Americans take credit for lots of ideas, but this is a Singaporean idea. This is not an American idea. So when people say this is an American plot, well, the Americans borrowed it from the Singaporean plot or the New Zealand and Chilean plot. It's true that the Obama administration, trying to figure out what to do in Asia, suddenly glommed onto TPP, but I don't think that in terms of the trade aspects, that this was really intended at the very beginning as a kind of balancing or what have you. Of course, it may have been transformed into that. So if we think about TPP, what are the pros and cons? I haven't talked about the FTAP. I can give you a reference to my paper on FTAP, which I criticize FTAP, which is getting revived. But basically, even with TPP, as you know, there's a lot of negatives. It's excluding non-negotiating members. It's not clear if other members will join. And of course, there's difficulty in reconciling TPP, even with existing FTAs, that the US has or Australia has and the like. On the other hand, there's a lot of strong support for this agreement and the core agreement continues. So let me just conclude very briefly by thinking about this issue, which is that the FTA, and all these FTA, mega FTAs, which I'm interested in, I mean, they are a good step in some sense. Whether they're a step to the WTO, I'm somewhat skeptical. I think they're seen as a substitute for the WTO. And despite the Bali package, I think it's really in the WTO that people should be devoting their attention. And I think whether it's China or the United States or the EU, that is the forum that is actually most beneficial for everyone. And the idea that there are too many countries, I think, is a silly argument, because the Uruguay round was negotiated with 125 countries. To claim that the addition of 25 more countries or 28 more countries fundamentally changes the institution is wrong in my view. I think the problem is that the US went off and started negotiating FTAs, and the Europeans began to negotiate FTAs, and then they say, my God, there's no progress in the WTO. Well, the causality may be the other way. The reason there's no progress in the WTO is because you're going off and negotiating FTAs. And even China has joined that game. But China, of course, resisted the most of all of these countries. Finally, we've seen that the Asia-Pacific has gone from under-institutionalization to over-institutionalization. And then the last one is an obvious point that we've already heard, that what will be the foci of integration in the Asia-Pacific? And some see this as a competition, but I don't see this as a competition. I also think these can be complementary institutions, and countries can join RCEP, and when they're ready to join the next step, they can join TPP. So I think this idea that, no, you know, this is exclusive blocks or specialized blocks is not really a logical idea. And since I teach the political economy trade, I obviously appreciate politics. But in this case, it doesn't seem to me that if this is the only pivot that the United States is using to Asia, I think the United States is in big trouble. So I don't think TPP should be seen as the great instrument of American imperialism in the Asia Pacific. Thank you.